They're super useful, they're super helpful, and let's be honest, emergencies do happen. Welcome back to our channel, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're glad to have you here. My name is Lindy and this is Tando, and we are Skilled Finances. So today we're going to be breaking down how to save up an emergency fund. A lot of the times, a lot of us probably don't think about having an emergency fund until an emergency happens. We used to do this ourselves. Our emergency fund really used to be our credit card. So if an emergency happened, we'd be like, oh yeah, we've got a credit card. We can just dip into that or use that to cover any emergencies. But along the way, we've started to learn that actually it's such a powerful thing and a beautiful thing to have an emergency fund set aside for whenever any emergencies come up. And it gives you that financial security and that peace that if an emergency does happen, you've actually got a little pot or some small savings that you can dip into to cover that emergency. So stick with us as we go through the process of building an emergency fund and what an emergency fund is and what it's useful for.
An emergency fund is one of those things that you constantly hear about in terms of having one in place before you make any major financial decisions. This could include moving homes, starting investing, or any other decisions that you make. But not many people understand, what they are, why it's important to have them, and what you do with them. So that's what we want to answer today. So an emergency fund is really kind of money you set aside for emergencies. It's in the name, really. There's
Yeah.
nothing else to say about that. But the reason why it's important is essentially money that you put aside to be used when life happens. And now, not if life happens, but when life happens, because things will happen unexpectedly. It could be your health, it could be you may lose your job or be put on
Yeah.
furlough, be made redundant. It could be anything really that will break down in your home, in your car, or anything like that will essentially impact your finances. And that's why it's important to have an emergency fund. It's money that you can dip into to cover any unexpected happenings when life happens.
So now that you know what an emergency fund is, let's look at how much one should save as an emergency fund. Now, there's so many different opinions out there about how much people should have as an emergency fund or how much people should actually start off with. So opinion number one, you've got Dave Ramsey, who suggests having at least £1,000 to start off with. And then opinion number two, you have people that then think, actually, why not start off with your 1 month's worth of living expenses? So if you live on 1,500 a month, then start off with that. But if you live on 3,000 a month, then start off with that. But you then have people that then suggest having at least 3 months worth as an emergency fund, and that's another popular opinion. But what we get from all these different opinions is that the more that you actually have, the better it is, and the better it is for you if an emergency does then come up. But the aim is to then go probably for 6 months worth of your living expenses. That way, if anything happens, at least you're covered and at least you're sorted and you have something to dip into in case of an emergency.
Yeah, so if you live on £1,500 every single month, saving up an emergency fund that covers you for 6 months means that you are aiming to save £9,000
Mm.
as your emergency fund. And that's a hefty amount. That's a lot of money to
Yeah.
save up as an emergency fund. But the truth is, emergencies do happen. Life will
Yeah.
come up, and they don't come announced either. They will literally spring up on you at any moment, at any time. And there could be costly emergencies as well, whether that's illness, whether that's car repairs, or whatever else comes up along the way. So you kind of have to really think about how much would you feel comfortable with, really, as a
Yeah.
minimum to have as an emergency fund. If £9,000 is something that you want to have, give you that security, then great. But if you feel like £1,000 is all you need and that's enough for your emergency fund based on your circumstances,
Yeah.
then that's great as well. But what's definitely not great is to not have anything, because you're going to need something to cover you should an emergency happen. However, it's important to remember that an emergency fund is only meant to cover your bare minimum living
Right.
expenses. It doesn't include personal shopping or going out or anything like that. It's literally just to cover you should the worst happen. How much would you need to live on every single month to cover your bills? And that's essentially what the emergency fund should, in theory, cover. So, how do you calculate how much you actually need for your emergency fund. The way that we did it was we literally looked at our budget and said, how much do we live on and as a bare minimum? So this
Right.
is looking at things like household bills, gas, electricity, that kind of thing. And also looking at insurances that we do have that we feel are important to us,
Yeah.
debt payments that we've got that we have to pay for every single month, whether we like it or not, sort of thing, and any other financial obligations that you do have. And this could also include household groceries, but we exclude things like personal shopping, takeaways, eating out, everything like
Yeah.
that, because those are things that we will not necessarily keep doing should we find ourselves in a sticky situation financially. So it's kind of thinking about what are the things that you have in your budget that you either have to pay for by obligation or for you to live, whether you're if you're going to be in an emergency situation, and those are the things that you want your emergency fund to essentially cover. So let's go back to the example of 1,500 as an example. If you live on £1,500 per month, what this means is you may choose to save 1,500 to cover you for one
Yeah.
month's worth of living expenses. Or if you think to yourself, well, I'd like to stretch my emergency fund to cover me for 3 months, then that's 4,500 that you would need to save. And you can just literally keep going and going
Yeah.
up until you reach a figure that you're comfortable with. Obviously, the more you save, the better. You're giving yourself that security, that room to breathe should an emergency happen. And also, you're giving yourself the freedom to make different choices.
Right.
And this is the other power that an emergency fund gives you. With an emergency fund, it's not just a case of saying, well, the car's broken down, so I need money for that.
Yeah.
But if you manage to save up, say, 6 months worth of living expenses, it might give you the option to maybe take 6 months out of work to do something
Yeah.
different. It might give you the option to give you room to quit one job whilst you're looking for another job and make those kinds of decisions, because you know for a fact that even though you don't have any money coming in at this stage, you've got the finances backing to pay for your living expenses whilst you're looking for the next thing.
Absolutely. And I can relate to that one because a few years back, we found ourselves in a situation where I was in a job that I genuinely did not like. And it got to that point where I'd be going to work and then coming home and I'd be like so upset. Like, I'm really not enjoying this job and I don't know why I'm staying in it. But I feel like there's times when you can go to work and then you feel like, actually, I may not like things that are happening on a day to day in this job, but I can deal with it. But I had gotten past that point and I was at the point of, actually, I don't feel like I can get up, get out of bed and go to this job anymore. And it's really now affecting me outside of work and it's affecting my mental health and I need to leave. So we then had a conversation about it. And because we had that financial backing and because we had that emergency fund, we decided that, you know what, leave the job. Like, your mental health and your well-being is more important than the job itself in this moment. So we were fortunate enough that I was able to leave that job. So whilst I was looking for a new job, we had that financial backing because we had saved the money up. So I was able to be out of work for a couple of months because we had that money and we were able to still live life as normal and still live and still have the things that we still had whilst I was working. So that is a huge, huge benefit because you can look at that money as a financial freedom fund. It allows you to have that freedom to do what you want because at least, you know, like at the back of your head, you know that actually I've got that financial backing, I've got that money so I can afford to at least look after me, look after my well-being and look after myself instead of being stuck in a job that I really, really dislike.
Yeah, I mean, and to kind of add on to that, it wasn't just a case of like you didn't like it or you really disliked it and it affected your mental health on the surface. It really started to affect you. Even coming home, you would be so miserable,
Mm,
and you just want to just kind of lock yourself up in the bedroom and just kind of give yourself time to breathe. And then in the morning before going to work, sometimes you'd
yeah.
be in a really bad state because you didn't want to go to work, and so having that emergency fund, genuinely speaking, put us in a very, very strong position to make that certain decision.
Yeah.
Sure, we needed the money. Like nobody would turn around and say, "No, we don't need
Absolutely.
money." We weren't
Yeah.
we weren't making like a big bucks here. Like we were just generally speaking on I guess, an average wage, with average bills. But it was in that moment that we prioritized our mental health and
Yeah.
your happiness, and you just having that sense of like not going to a place of work where you're constantly being degraded and devalued,
Yeah.
and just saying, actually, you know what, let's just make a very different choice here that would make your life better but also make your general well-being better, which obviously then impacts our marriage and everything else like that. So that's the power of an emergency fund, and that's the power of a financial freedom fund, in the sense that it gives you that opportunity to make very, very different life choices. Fair enough, it starts off, as a very small thing. Okay, I need to save £1,000, or I need to save £3,000, and think about, like, oh, it's for emergencies, it's for when this happens or when
Yeah.
that happens. But when you've actually accumulated quite a bit of money to cover you for a good amount of time, at the time we had like 6 months worth of living expenses covered in our emergency fund. And that literally allowed us to say, yeah, quit your job. It's not good for you. And wait until you get the next job. You've got 6 months to look for the next job.
Yeah.
And, luckily you actually managed to get a job within that time. But that's essentially the freedom that the emergency fund allowed us to have.
So now let's look at where you can actually save your emergency fund. We would say that it's important for you to save it in a place where you can easily access the money. In times of an emergency, the last thing you want to be doing is struggling to access your money when an emergency has just happened. So it's important for you to be able to easily access it to get the money that you need and then cover that particular emergency that you have. However, just because it's saved in a place where you can easily access it, try not to use that money for any other thing besides an emergency. So just because you're scrolling on Instagram and maybe you see something that you like and then you think, oh, I like that, I might as well just buy it. And you find yourself in a situation where you don't have the money to buy that item, your first thought shouldn't then be, but I've got an emergency fund and I can easily access it. So let me just easily access it and get some money to buy that particular thing that I've seen. So save it in a place where you can easily access it, but don't use it for things that it shouldn't then be used for. You've got a purpose and a reason for that money. You've got a reason why you're saving it. So try not to use it for every other reason that isn't that particular reason.
Yeah, buying a new pair of shoes is not an emergency, is it?
No.
That's just something that you just want to do for yourself. The second thing that I would add on as well to think about is that you want to put your money somewhere that is going to be safe and quite secure.
Right.
And this is one of the reasons why people say, before you start investing, have an emergency fund. Because when you look at investments have an element of risk. Sure, the risk profiles are different. Some investments have lower risks than others, but nonetheless, that risk exists, especially in the short term.
Right.
Essentially, what that means is that if you put your emergency fund into an investment, there is an element of risk that the money may lose value in the short term. And therefore, imagine you put your emergency fund into an investment, and then 3 months later, when an emergency actually happens, you go to your investments and they've lost value.
Yeah.
You've basically lost the value of your emergency fund because you parked it somewhere where there's an element of risk. So with an emergency fund, generally speaking, we would say put it somewhere that's quite safe and secure. So you think about basically your basic savings accounts. Now, I know inflation is there and the interest rates that you get from your savings accounts are basically pointless because they don't grow as much as the rate of inflation,
Right.
hence why we invest. But then you do need that, as Linda said earlier on, you need that easy access, but you also need that safety and security there.
Yeah.
So this may look differently based on where you are. So if you're very early on in your emergency fund building journey, definitely, you may want to look at a savings account and build your emergency fund up to begin with. But at some point, you may then think to yourself, well, I've got X number of months saved as a cash savings. Now, potentially, you've got the freedom to boost your savings in an investment instead. But all of this depends on how much you have
Right.
and how much you're willing to keep as cash and how much you're willing to then put towards investments.
So we hope you found today's discussion very useful. We are definitely advocates for having an emergency fund. We've definitely found ourselves in tricky situations where emergencies have happened and we've needed the money. And because we've had the emergency fund, we've been able to dip into it and then cover those emergencies. And I dread to think what would have happened had we been in situations where an emergency happens and now we're having to solely rely on a credit card as we used to do back in the day. But now we find ourselves in situations where at least we're sorted and we're covered if anything does then happen. And as we said before, you can also use them as a financial freedom fund. We found ourselves in that situation where I didn't like my job anymore and I was able to leave. Why? Because we had the emergency fund. So definitely don't sleep on them. They're super useful. They're super helpful. And let's be honest, emergencies do happen. Life does happen. Anything can happen at any point. But at least if you've got that financial backing, I feel like it's sort of like a cushion. and it cushions that emergency a bit more than if you just didn't have anything, and then you find yourself now scrambling to put finances together and put money together. It can be pretty tough if you're already having to deal with a difficult emergency. So don't sleep on having an emergency fund.
Yeah. And so thank you for joining us today. If you have liked what you've learnt, definitely hit the like button, and obviously subscribe if you're willing to stick around and learn more from us, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any further discussions. Now, what we'd like to know in the comments is, what's your one giveaway, your one takeaway, or even your one tip to building an emergency fund? Put it in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us.